Welcome back. So today we're diving straight into this explainer on what's being called the $38 trillion sleight of hand. We're going to unpack exactly how the US is quietly managing a completely incomprehensible national debt. Seriously, what's happening right under our noses functions pretty much like a massive macroeconomic magic trick. We're going to break down exactly how this fiscal sleight of hand is actually executed, and more importantly, what it means for the everyday economy. Let's get into it.
Just to wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this, $38 trillion. To put that into perspective, the source notes that stacking that many $1 bills wouldn't just reach the moon, it would go well past it. For decades, right, we've kind of treated this like a harmless high score in a video game, but the math has radically changed. We are actually now in a reality where the US is spending more just on the interest for this debt than it spends on national defense or even the entire Medicaid program. Absolutely wild.
And honestly, that interest creates a massive problem because huge portions of government spending, think Social Security, are mandatory, right? They're politically untouchable. So the government can't just, cut back to pay the interest. Instead, they actually have to issue new debt just to pay the mandatory interest on the old debt. The analysis describes this perfectly. It's literally like borrowing from a brand new credit card just to pay the minimum monthly balance on the old one. It's a terrifying exponential feedback loop.
So what on earth do we do? How do we fix this? Well, the source argues that the two traditional fixes are pretty much practically and politically impossible in the US today. Option one is brutal austerity. That would mean doing things like doubling income taxes or completely abolishing the military. That's instant political suicide, and it would trigger a depression. Option two is explicit default, where the government just throws its hands up and says, we aren't paying. But because global finance relies heavily on US treasuries as risk-free collateral, an explicit default would trigger an instant, catastrophic global financial apocalypse. So, neither of those is going to happen.
That brings us to the first part of our explainer, the soft default strategy. Basically, the magic trick revealed. Because those first two options are off the table, the crucial point is that the government uses a third option. It's called a soft default. It's essentially the path of least resistance. Here's how it works. They pay back every single cent they owe, but, and this is the kicker, with currency that has been significantly devalued. Let's do the math on this. According to the source, if the government owes $30 trillion and inflation is running at 5%, the real purchasing power of that debt shrinks. In just one single year, $1.5 trillion of real debt is effectively erased. Poof! And the absolute genius of it, they achieved this massive debt reduction without a single tax hike or budget cut. Sure, the bondholders get their money back, but that money buys way fewer goods.
Now, you want to know the craziest part? This isn't even a new idea. We are simply rerunning the post-World War II playbook. Think back to 1945. The debt-to-GDP ratio hit 119%. So how did they fix it? Well, for an entire decade, the Federal Reserve artificially capped interest rates at around 2.5%, while inflation ran hot at an average of 6%. That means every single year, bondholders lost 3.5% of their purchasing power. These negative real interest rates systematically and silently liquidated the national debt over a decade.
Which leads us to part two, the three tools of erasure, or as we can call it, the modern upgrade.
Because to execute this kind of stealth wealth transfer today, the analysis outlines three highly modernized mechanisms. These tools essentially rig the market, manipulate the inflation data, and keep the government totally solvent despite that massive debt load. Let's break down exactly how each of these functions, starting with the first one.
Tool number one creates what's known as the captive buyer. Look, normally, if a borrower has $38 trillion in debt, a free market would demand incredibly high interest rates, right? Maybe 10% or more, just to offset that massive risk. But the government obviously can't afford that. So what do? They use complex banking regulations, things like Basel III or Dodd-Frank, to literally force banks, insurance companies, and pension funds to hold government debt. They classify these bonds as high-quality liquid assets, which basically means banks are legally required to buy them, regardless of the terrible returns. This artificially suppresses the interest rates the government actually has to pay.
Moving on to Tool 2, which is termed the broken compass. This is all about manipulating the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. See, the government pays out trillions based on CPI for programs like Social Security, so keeping that official number low saves them billions of dollars. And they do this through, statistical sleight of hand. For example, they use something called substitution bias. They basically argue that if steak gets too expensive, hey, you'll just buy hamburger instead. So officially, your cost of living hasn't really gone up, right? They also use hedonic adjustments. Say a new car costs $5,000 more than last year, but it has some new safety features. The government claims the price didn't actually rise because the quality improved. Suddenly, you're paying luxury prices, but they're telling you it's a bargain. The source points out this effectively gaslights the public about the true everyday cost of survival.
And finally, tool 3 is fiscal dominance. Now, historically, a central bank is supposed to be totally independent, right? Raising rates to kill inflation when needed. But in an era of fiscal dominance, the debt is so unimaginably massive that the central bank loses that independence. Its main job just becomes preventing government bankruptcy. So the Federal Reserve steps in as the buyer of last resort through quantitative easing. They literally print money to buy the government bonds that nobody else wants. Now, this keeps the government afloat for sure, but it also aggressively floods the economy with brand new dollars, watering down the value of the money already sitting in your wallet.
Okay, let's jump into part 3, the Great Wealth Transfer, and something called the Cantillon Effect.
This all builds into the very real social consequences of this money printing. It's actually an 18th century concept called the Cantillon effect, and it drives this K-shaped economy we're seeing. Think about it. When the government prints $1 trillion, they don't exactly hand it out to everyday citizens, do they? No, large financial institutions get this zero-interest money first, and they use it to immediately buy up assets like stocks and real estate. By the time that money finally trickles down to the wage-earning class, inflation has already caused rent and groceries to spike. So the wealthy get the money before inflation hits, and the working class gets it after.
And because of this dynamic, the old financial rules, they just no longer apply. That traditional advice of safely saving your cash in the bank or relying on a standard 60-40 stock and bond portfolio, according to the source, that's now a guaranteed loss of purchasing power. The system effectively forces everyday people completely out of safe savings and pushes them into risky speculation, buying up stocks, real estate, or crypto just to try and outrun this aggressive devaluation of the currency. Which brings us to the final section, Part 4, the digital endgame. We're talking central bank digital currencies.
The explainer details that a transition to a digital dollar, or a CBDC, is not fundamentally about user convenience. The thesis warns it's actually about absolute monetary control. See, physical cash is the ultimate escape valve. If interest rates drop below zero, you can just hide cash on your mattress, but a CBDC removes that escape entirely. It gives the central bank the power to instantly apply negative interest rates directly to your account, or even program expiration dates on your money to literally force you to spend it. It's about absolute state control over how fast money moves in the economy.
So the ultimate stark reality presented here is that this massive $38 trillion debt, it is never going to be paid back in real current terms. It will only ever be inflated away. And this system heavily rewards the asset-owning class, people holding scarce, unprintable things like real estate, profitable businesses, or Bitcoin, while it effectively liquidates the savings of the middle class. The traditional dream of simply saving your way to prosperity has really been replaced by a mandatory game of asset survival.
I want to leave you with a final, really provocative thought from the source. Because when governments get truly desperate about debt and inflation, they don't always stay subtle. I mean, look at history. In 1933, FDR's Executive Order 6102 literally criminalized the ownership of gold. They seized it from citizens just to protect the state's monetary position. So if history shows that desperate governments will simply change the laws to seize wealth during a national financial emergency, what does that mean for your assets, your savings, or your 401k tomorrow? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the numbers.